Hi everyone, this video is going to take you through Poppies by Jane Weir. Again, a nice detailed discussion, very much based on the team sessions from the summer. So for anyone who wasn't able to participate in those, this should help you get caught up. So obviously, firstly, when we think about poppies, we've got very strong associations with them. And these, some of the top Google images, and I had to spend a bit of time finding just a picture of poppies, because poppies are in the British culture almost inextricably connected with the idea of loss and death and remembrance, particularly through war. So by calling her poem Poppies, Weir is immediately creating that connection of the sense of loss to conflict, and the sense of remembrance. And obviously that permeates this poem really powerfully. And it also helps to provide the setting, or at least the time setting, for part of the poem, as it begins 3 days before Armistice Sunday, which a lot of us would talk about as being like Poppy Sunday and things. So that connection with this symbol of loss and remembrance for people who we've lost to war is obviously going to be a major theme for the poem. So some context before we start. So Weir is an English poet. It was published in 2005, and it was written in response to Carol Ann Duffy's call for more war poems about the deaths of British soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is from Duffy was not quite the poet laureate at the time, but she was a very notable poet. And she turned around and went, where is the poetry to commemorate these dead like we have for World War One? So it's sort of a similar project to what Simon Armitage was doing with Remains and his attempt to try and create literature to illuminate what was happening in more modern conflict. So in this poem, Weir imagines the trials and difficulties of war from the perspective of a mother who sends her child off to fight. So I think this is a really powerful poem because it's very useful in terms of comparison, because it gives us a new perspective. So we're immediately going, okay, so we can compare this to Remains or Exposure, where we're looking at sort of more, or Bayonet Charge, that sense of someone in the conflict. Here we've got someone who's distanced from it and feels powerless because of their inability to sort of do anything productive. So it's a poem that's full of grief, and this sense of all parents feel a sense of grief and loss as their children go off and become independent and don't need them anymore. But here there's the added complexity of her child having gone off to fight, and obviously the added danger and concern that brings. Also worth noting that Weir is a textiles designer as well as a writer, and obviously you'll notice a huge amount of tactile imagery. Tactile means to the touch. So this idea of the physicality of how things feel and touch, and all this imagery to do with fabrics and textiles, is quite a natural decision on her part. So there's a really excellent interview with Jane Weir out and about, and there's some extracts from it. So I'd been reading a lot about women's experience during the First and Second World Wars, and particularly struck by their diversity. So looking at all the different women's experiences of war, which is often an area that gets heavily overlooked. I was aware of the variety of women's voices, in particular mothers, wives and girlfriends, writing from the home front to the battlefield front line in letters. I read letters from all sorts of women, including some by Susan Owen, Wilfred Owen's mother. So I think that's quite an interesting idea, this idea that in the past there's actually quite a lot of literature of female perspectives at the time being written, and that was actually something that was getting lost in the world of video calls and emails and things like that. People aren't writing these things down anymore, and so that sense of that documentation and that recording for historical posterity is starting to get lost, and was something that we wanted to address. At the time, the news was full of conflict: Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, and we've got the Balkans, Africa, and we very rarely hear the women speak. I have 2 sons myself, and I'd read in the newspapers, seen on TV, the verdicts from the inquests on soldiers killed in Iraq. Who could forget the harrowing testimonies of the soldiers' families, and in particular their mothers? And I was angry and frustrated at the apathy, or what I perceived as voicelessness and ability to be heard or get any kind of justice. I wanted to write a poem from the point of view of a mother and her relationship with her son, a child who was loved and cherished and protected, and it had led to this. heightened an absolute fear that parents experience in letting their children go, the anxiety and ultimately the pain of loss. I hope to somehow channel all this to convey it into something concise and contemporary, but also historical classic in terms of universal experience. So that's Weir's intention going into this, is that she was angry that people weren't being listened to, that particularly the mothers were left powerless, having lost their children, to get their voice and get any justice out there. So she wanted to give voice to them. This is not an autobiographical poem. It's based on her experiences and feelings as a mother, but not a real experience with her children. Okay, but what she wanted to do was go, every parent worries about their child going off. This is awful. I could write something for this, and I love this idea of having this universal experience, that idea that this could be almost any mother. There is no specifics really in this poem, so we get this sense of universality in experience. I'm going into my notes now, so apologies. So there is an inherent ambiguity in this poem. This poem could be about a mother's fear for her son, who she can no longer keep safe, and it's all about her fears and worries for him as he goes out into the world. Or it could be mourning for a son who has died. Both are valid interpretations. It is inherently ambiguous. It is unclear whether or not the son has died, or whether that's just her fear for what could happen to him. Okay, what you would need to do when discussing this poem is use lots of that tentative language. It appears, it suggests, it could be. Okay, there's a sense of mourning for the young child who no longer needs her, and that now he's this independent young man. She almost feels sort of irrelevant, and it does prompt that question: does death need to happen for mourning to occur? She can mourn the loss of the young child she can keep safe, whether or not her now grown son is still alive. And I think that's a very universal experience of parenthood, that idea of the fear of not being able to keep your children safe, and the necessity to allow them that independence at the same time as being aware of how dangerous it could be. So I'm just thinking about the types of conflict we've got in this poem. Obviously, we've got lots of military language because her life is being heavily influenced by the military, even though she's not an active participant, because she is the parent of an active participant. The military has that influence, and that comes through the language that's used. There's inner conflict where she's remembering the childhood of her son versus the independent adult he has become, and her sense of grief and loss, but also awareness that she has to let him go, which we see. And there is that maternal instinct to protect versus allowing him to grow and doing your job as a parent, which one of the saddest ways I ever heard it described was the point of parenting is to make it so children no longer need you. And that's what she's sort of done, but obviously that's having a significant impact and effect on her. So going through this, we're going to have three sort of key ideas as usual. So we're going to be looking at effects of conflict in sort of the purpley dark blue. We're going to be talking about loss and absence and the feelings of that in the light blue, and memory and the sort of conflict that creates in that pink. So again, I just want to reinforce, this is not an autobiographical poem. This is not based on her own experiences. So like Armitage, like Duffy, like Hughes, these are using inspiration from reality and the experiences of others to create a new story. And quite often all of those poems have this sense of trying to stand for more than one specific person to a certain extent. They want to give a sense of this is happening quite a lot. So some key vocabulary for this poem. So tactile imagery. Tactile means to the touch. So everything that's to do with how something feels is tactile imagery. We've got transience coming in again, so obviously we've used that in Ozymandias, that sense that things have to change. And this has got a very complex time structure in this, because the mother speaking in the poem bounces around all the way through her memories. So this sense of the transience of life, because these memories are fragmented and just sort of don't necessarily come in any logical order. It's an ambiguous poem, as we've already talked about. The big overall plot is ambiguous. We don't know whether he's alive or dead. And then on more on a more granular level as we look through. And there's a lot of domestic imagery in here, which I think is really interesting and provides a really nice counterpoint to something like Remains or Bayonet Charge, which are obviously set very much in the conflict and that personal experience of the conflict. Here instead we've got all these domestic imageries of mothers playing with their children and her experience of being left behind in this entirely different sphere. So that leaves a really nice place for you to do some comparison, because you can look at the different linguistic choices and settings and how that works. So some key methods in this poem, as I said, we've got a lot of shifting time in this, which creates this sense of overwhelming sort of confusion and chaos. We've got tactile imagery, we've got imagery of hurt or death, there's a lot of painful imagery in here. We've got plenty of symbolism, which we'll look at, and the use of the voice itself. Now, I personally find this poem very affecting. I find incredibly sad, and I think the voice that comes through feels very authentic for me. That sense of her remembering her little boy and her sense of utter desperation as he grows up and leaves is one that I find really powerful. Okay, so as I said, this poem immediately locates itself in time, 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and the poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. So this poem is all done in relation to Armistice Sunday, which is the 11th, the Armistice Day, Poppy Day, is the 11th of November. Armistice Sunday is the Sunday closest to that. By calling the poem Poppies, by the first line talking about Armistice Sunday, she is immediately, and that's a nice structural word, remember, for your analysis, she is immediately focusing us on the sense of death and loss that inevitably results from war. So that is making sure that all the way through this poem there's this sort of melancholy aspect to it, where we are constantly aware that she's talking in relation to loss caused by conflict. And she's focusing on this idea of poppies have been placed on individual war graves. So she's looking at the loss of other people and that sense of the importance of remembrance. And obviously this poem is all about her remembering. And the whole idea of the poppies is we wear them, lest we forget. And that sense of keeping those memories alive and sort of cherishing those memories, and that's what she's doing here. So she is keeping alive those memories of her child when he was smaller, and the sort of pain that comes with. We then get to before you left, so we're immediately shifting, but we're not entirely sure when he left. Is she talking about him leaving in his uniform for war? But at the end of the poem, this stanza, she's talking about his blazer, which is more of a school image. So we've immediately got this sense of conflating different images and this sense of, and almost like, because Armistice Sunday is so important in Britain and because it's something we do annually, you will have lots of memories, or your parents will have lots of memories of, helping you with the poppies when you're little because you can't manage the pins and how that works as you grow up. So I suppose it makes sense that they're all getting a little conflated together here. So she's talking about, I pinned one onto your lapel, which is a real caring image. And again, we'll get that all the way through. The idea of the little things she used to be able to do for him, which she can no longer do, and that sense of purpose that it gave her, perhaps, that she no longer feels. And she's pinning this poppy on, but she describes it as crimped petals, spasms of paper red, which is quite a violent, painful image, almost like you've got blood spurting from somewhere. You could talk about spasms of red, and obviously we'd have to talk about the connotations of that word red there. And where you wear your poppy is often over your heart, so there is that subtle connection there to something a bit more violent and a bit more painful. And the idea that the poppy disrupts a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. So blockade is a military term from the semantic field to do with the military, and we'll have that later on with like reinforcements and things. And the idea that she is disrupting that blockade, she's getting in the way of that. So there's a sense of almost like defiance or something coming through there, and creating that little conflict of her sort of versus the military. We then go into a much longer stanza, and she talks about sellotape bandaged around my hand. I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could. So again, that image of her doing something for him. And so here, I don't know if your parents have ever done this, you wrap sellotape loads and loads around your hand, a bit like a boxer does with all the tape, but so the sticky side's facing out, and then you can pat down some clothes and it picks up all the rogue cat and dog hairs and things like that. But the use of the word bandaged obviously has some significant connotations. That sense of injury. Is this sort of her holding herself together with these domestic images? Is it her fear for him getting injured? Is it a real bandaging, or is it, more of a metaphorical I mean, obviously she's not really bandaging herself with sellotape, but that sense of, is that the best word to describe it, or is it that metaphorical bandage of these are things I can do, and it's sort of holding her together as she's getting ready to send him off, and she's still fussing around him while she's got the chance. So we've got this very domestic, caring, tactile imagery when she could touch him, when she could look after him, when he wasn't gone. And again, gone here, that ambiguity. We don't know if gone means he's died or if gone means he's just on the other side of the world. So she's rounding up the cat hair. She's smoothed down her, your shirt's upturned collar. So she's trying to make sure he looks really presentable. Steeled the softening of my face. Now, I think that's a really powerful metaphor there. And obviously the steeling of her face contrasts all the soft fabric imagery we've had so far, and shows that sort of strength she's trying to show. But also you've got that sense of, if you steel yourself for something, you brace for it, you sort of have to gear yourself up for it. And this steel, the softening of her face, it's almost a really effective metaphor, I think, for she's like clenching her jaw or something. And in my mind, it's that sense of trying not to cry. Because when you cry, your face sort of crumples, doesn't it? We use that sort of word. But here instead, she's hardening herself against that impending separation. She wants to show her strength for him. So she steels the softening of her face. She clenches her jaw. She makes sure that she doesn't sort of let him down by showing all those soft emotions coming through. And so then we have a sense of even further back. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play it being Eskimos like we did when you were little. So that sense of, she's no longer able to do that. As he's already growing up, there are things you can't do that you can do when they're really little. So she's no longer allowed or able to sort of, play it being Eskimos and things like that. And the memory of that very close, physically affectionate relationship of the mother and child when they're little, obviously then contrasts to her still trying to do what she can for him as he's leaving, and then contrasts further to the woman who's in sort of the now in the churchyard just before Armistice Sunday without her son at all. And so we get that sense of the sadness coming through as well, that she's lost that version of her son. She's lost the child that she could always look after and protect, and gradually has sort of, this loss happens over time. There is a separation sort of that happens, in a sense almost of rejection perhaps as he grows. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled blackthorns of your hair. So that idea of, she holds herself back, she's got all of those verbs, wanted to, resisted, she's going against what she wants to do for his sake. So there's that sense of internal conflict, sort of self-sacrifice that's going on there. The gelled blackthorns, there's lots of people out there who like to make a lot of the Christ-like imagery of that with the crown of thorns and things. Slightly less excited about that myself. But for me, again, then you suddenly got different conflated times, because no one's going off to war. The army isn't letting you in with gelled, spiky hair. So suddenly we've got that sense of, perhaps we've got teenagers, maybe heading off to school, and that's conflating with him leaving there. But blackthorns obviously are also spiky and distancing. They discourage touch. Okay. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt. So this sense that she's almost quietening herself, she's suppressing her words. All the things she wants to say, she flattens and turns into felt. And we get that sense of the changing relationship, the loss of closeness that she mourns from him being a child. And she has to hold herself back. But I think what's also interesting is that image of turning into felt. It's almost like when you're trying not to cry and your tongue feels a bit big and you can't talk properly. And the way she's almost like trying to swallow it down with that very fabricy image again, as if she's got like wool in her mouth or something, that's making it difficult for her to speak. And we get this sense of enjambment here as well, turning felt, slowly melting. So creates that little pause and that sense of something being lost. All the words are melting away, and the enjambment has that sense of all them joining together and disappearing, and all those things she could have said that she didn't say. And is there now a regret about that as well? I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. So that sense that for her, this is her almost battle. I was brave, you know, she's going, no, I did this, I was brave, I managed to hold it together, as almost as if she's going into conflict. And she walks him even to the very boundary, she walks him to the front door, so there's that sense of his impending absence needs her to be courageous, needs strength from her, and she knows it's her job to make it successful, however much it's hurting her. So again, we've got that inner conflict where she's not enjoying this isn't a thing she wants, but it's also the thing that she has to do in her job as his mum. And then that sense of throwing the door open, like she's putting on a show, it's almost aggressive, you know, she's trying to show just how much she's supporting him. But obviously with the internal monologue we're getting here, we can see that this is actually a very hard thing for her to do. And then we suddenly switch slightly to his point of view, where he sees outside the front door the world overflowing like a treasure chest. So we get his point of view here in that sense of being eager for independence, but it's also a childish image, the idea of treasure chests and playing at pirates and things. So there's that sense of still she fears for his maturity and whether he's really ready for this. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. So he has no hesitation, he's gone, and there's something sad about that for her, that there is no hesitation, but she does call him intoxicated, which is normally a word we'd use to suggest a lack of control or being under the influence, like intoxicated by drink or drugs. So there's that sense almost of resentment coming through, like he's been sort of so heavily influenced by the military or by the promises of the wider world, and she thinks it's almost distorting his reality a little bit, or his judgment, and that he's perhaps making a bit of a mistake. So it's a really subtle little word there, but that use of that word intoxicated does suggest that she's not entirely convinced that what he's doing is the right thing. After you've gone, I went into your bedroom and released a songbird from its cage. So that's obviously a really interesting image and quite ambiguous. You know, it could symbolise letting him have his freedom, her acceptance that she has lost the fight. She goes and gives this symbol of this caged bird. Freedom is like that symbol of allowing something to fly and go and stretch its wings, all these sorts of imageries and metaphors that we use in everyday life to give that sense of independence. But there could also be that sense of her sadness, almost as if she's gone into his bedroom and sobbed it out, and she's cried like the cry of a songbird to let out all of the words that had melted into one, instead come out like a songbird song. And then this bird imagery obviously continues through here. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree. So a dove normally symbolises peace, but this one single dove flew from the pear tree, almost symbolising his liberation, his freedom. And this is where it has led me. So now we're shifting out of her memories back into the churchyard where we were at the start, where remember it's cold, it's November, it's heading into winter, it's not an optimistic time of year, and she has been led to the churchyard where they're remembering the war dead by this bird, which we're sort of presuming symbolises her son. So again, we've got that sense of, has she been led there by his death or by her fear of his death? Okay, and both are perfectly valid interpretations. So this is where it has led me, skirting the churchyard walls. So obviously we know normally within a churchyard is the graveyard. So there's that sense of death and remembrance hanging over this, just like there was at the start of the poem. My stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats. I love that imagery. So again, that all of those are images to do with manipulating fabric. So instead of saying her stomach's churning, which is probably the phrase we more often use, she's got that real sense of the nausea and the discomfort that she's in, where it's her stomach is basically like folding in on itself. So that sense of unease and discomfort coming through. And she's hatless, without a winter coat of reinforcements of scarf, gloves. So you compare the way she's taking care of herself to the way she, earlier in the poem, she remembers taking care of him, where she's making sure he's nice and neat and his collar's sorted. And here she's stumbling around and she's in the middle of November, is sort of without that sense of protection. She's vulnerable, she's exposed. And almost you could interpret that as a sense of without him, she feels defenseless. Or perhaps symbolises her fear or her sense of suffering, that she can't be comfortable while he's not there, and she has that sort of sense of loss and grief. So into the last stanza now. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions of the war memorial. So again, that sense of tracing, she needs to feel it. So she needs to have that physical connection. So almost like this is her way of connecting with him when she can't have him in front of her. And the inscriptions on the war memorial are obviously the names of the people that it's memorialising. So is this about a fear of his name being there? Is it already? Is this the closest she can be? Is this her making that connection with him there? So there's this ambiguity going through about what the significance of making that physical connection is. And she leaned against it like a wishbone. So is that her making a wish? Is this her, this simile implying that she's wishing for him to come home? Again, it's got that little implicit memory of like family dinners and pulling the wishbone from the chicken and stuff. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. So we're combining the bird imagery that had to do with the tension and her fears for him, and the tactile imagery that obviously been used, and the longing for peace that comes from the dove, and this idea of them all being combined together, and that there's something that's a little bit worrisome about it, because an ornamental stitch is fragile, it's beautiful, but it's also unnecessary. It's just one little thing in the big tapestry of life. And so if that dove went, the bit and the grand scheme of things, not much has changed. So I suppose that could be her fear for her son and his life. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. So as ever again, we want to always think about how a poem ends. And I think the sadness of that image of her standing, leaning on the war memorial, remembering him as a child on the playground and just wishing that once more she'd hear his voice coming towards her. She's so immersed in her memories of him as a child and wishing that she could have him back. She's remembering those times when he was safe and she could keep him safe. And so the loss of that, whether or not he's alive or dead still, is almost overwhelming. And as I say, for me, I find particularly really affecting. And that's the image that Weir is leaving us with, is that image of her physically connected to the war memorial, but remembering the child she has lost. Whether or not he is still alive, that child is never coming back to her, despite everything she wishes that she could keep safe. And so that maternal instinct to protect is really at conflict with the reality of having to allow your children independence, however dangerous that may be. So remember, those endings of poems often really powerful in helping us to talk about structure and to talk about the messages that the poet is trying to convey.